The silence inside the chapel was almost unbearable. Only the faint rustling of black clothing and the muffled sounds of quiet sobs filled the air. The scent of white lilies mixed with the heavy weight of grief. Everyone had gathered to say goodbye to a hero. At the center of the aisle, beneath the stained glass windows that cast a pale morning glow, rested a dark oak casket. A neatly folded flag lay atop it, a symbol of duty, of sacrifice. But for those who knew Elijah Calloway, none of this felt fair. He had survived explosions, ambushes, freezing desert nights, only to end up here, lifeless, cold, without a final goodbye. His fellow soldiers stood in formation, their faces stiff, their jaws locked. Not one of them dared to break, yet their eyes betrayed the pain they carried. In the front pew, a woman with tightly pinned brown hair clutched a damp tissue between trembling fingers. Margaret, Elijah's sister, was the very image of grief. But no one in that room felt the loss more deeply than Orion. The German Shepherd K9 stood at the entrance of the chapel, his leash held firmly in the hands of the officer who had brought him. His chest rose and fell rapidly, as if he knew something was terribly wrong, but couldn't understand why. He sniffed the air, scanned the room, searching for a sign, an answer. But the moment his deep brown eyes locked onto the casket, something inside him shifted. Orion froze, his ears pricked up, and his gaze remained fixed on Elijah's still figure. Then, without warning, he did something no one expected. With a sudden, desperate pull, Orion broke free from the officer's grip. His nails clicked against the polished floor as he sprinted down the aisle, his body tense with urgency. Before anyone could stop him, he leaped. Gasps echoed through the chapel as Orion landed inside the coffin. The impact made the flag shift slightly, and for a fleeting second, it looked as if Elijah might wake up. Orion curled up on his chest, sniffing frantically as if waiting for a response. A low, mournful whimper escaped his throat, a sound heavy with desperation, with sorrow. Then he rested his head on Elijah's shoulder and closed his eyes. That was the moment something happened, something that made everyone in the chapel stop breathing, and what followed left no dry eyes in the room. This was just the beginning. If this story touched your heart, help me reach 100,000 subscribers. Leave a like and subscribe now to be part of this milestone. The chapel was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed against the chest and made it hard to breathe. Orion lay on Elijah's still body, his head resting against the soldier's shoulder, as if willing him to wake up. His body trembled slightly, his ears twitching at the faint echoes of quiet sobs in the room. He had been trained for war, for danger, for obedience, but nothing had prepared him for this. His partner, his handler, his whole world was gone, and he didn't understand why. A muffled cry broke through the air. Margaret, Elijah's sister, gripped the edge of the pew as though it was the only thing holding her upright. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from hours of crying. Around her, the rows of soldiers sat frozen, their uniforms crisp, their hands clasped tightly together. They had fought alongside Elijah. They had seen him walk through hell and come back, but nothing had prepared them for the sight of Orion, curled against his chest, refusing to let go. One of the officers stepped forward cautiously, reaching for Orion's collar, but the dog let out a deep, warning growl. It wasn't aggressive, it was protective, desperate. His grip on Elijah's uniform tightened, his nails pressing into the fabric as if anchoring himself to the man who had been his entire life. The officer hesitated, then slowly pulled his hand back. No one in the room had the heart to force Orion away. "Let him be," Chaplain Reynolds said softly. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of finality. "He's grieving, just like the rest of us." Margaret wiped at her tears with shaky fingers, her voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't understand. He thinks Elijah is coming back." The words hung in the air, suffocating. Orion let out a small whimper and nudged Elijah's arm with his nose, just like he used to do on the battlefield when his handler had been knocked down. It was a signal. "Get up, soldier." But there was no response. Then suddenly Orion's body stiffened. His ears pricked up. His breathing grew shallow. His head lifted slightly as his dark eyes locked onto something in the distance. Something no one else could see. A chill ran through the room. almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of Margaret's neck stand up. Orion wasn't just looking, he was tracking. Margaret swallowed hard, glancing at the chaplain, then back at Orion. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Orion didn't respond. He didn't move. He just kept staring. And nothing. A cold hush settled over the chapel. Orion remained perfectly still, his body tense, ears pricked forward. His deep brown eyes stayed locked on something no one else could see. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Grief was still thick in the air, but now something else crept in, something unnamed. Margaret wiped her tear-streaked face and followed Orion's gaze. But there was nothing there, just the casket, the flag, the flickering candlelight. Her pulse quickened. The other soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't normal. Orion was highly trained. He wouldn't react like this unless there was something there. Sergeant Dwayne Carter, who had served with Elijah overseas, cleared his throat. "What's he looking at?" His voice was hoarse, edged with something between fear and reverence. No one answered. The silence stretched. Orion didn't blink. His breathing was steady but focused, as if he was tracking a presence no one else could perceive. Then, without warning, Orion let out a soft, breathy whimper. It wasn't the mournful cry from before. This was different, subtle questioning. His tail wagged, just barely. He lifted his head an inch higher, his ears twitching as though listening for something faint and distant. And then he relaxed. Not fully, but enough for those closest to him to notice. Margaret's throat tightened. "Orion," she whispered, taking a step forward. But the dog didn't react to her. It was as if, for a moment, he wasn't here. He was somewhere else entirely, a place where sorrow didn't weigh so heavily, a place beyond this room, beyond the funeral, beyond death itself. The chaplain inhaled sharply, his hands tightening around the small Bible he held. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers trembled slightly. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "dogs see what we cannot." The words sent a ripple of unease through the room. Some of the soldiers shifted in their seats. Others sat frozen, watching Orion with a mix of curiosity and something dangerously close to fear. Then, just as suddenly as it started, Orion blinked and exhaled a deep sigh. His body softened, his tail curled loosely around his side. He turned his head, looking at Elijah's face one last time, before lowering his head to his chest. The room remained utterly still, as if waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Margaret let out a shaky breath and took a step closer. Carefully, she reached out, running her fingers gently over Orion's fur. He didn't flinch. He didn't resist. Whatever he had seen, if he had seen anything at all, was gone now. But the feeling in the chapel, that strange, indescribable shift in the air, lingered, and no one dared to speak of it. The chapel remained heavy with silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the air felt different, thicker, charged with something unseen. Orion lay still, his body pressed against Elijah's, his breathing slow and deep. It was as if, in that moment, the weight of grief had settled completely on him. Margaret knelt beside the casket, her fingers still tangled in Orion's fur. Her hands trembled, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. She had spent the last few days trying to accept that her brother was gone. But now, watching Orion, feeling his sorrow, it was like losing Elijah all over again. She wanted to tell him it would be okay, but the words caught in her throat. Because how could she promise something she wasn't sure of herself? Sergeant Carter cleared his throat, his voice strained. Orion's never acted like this before. His gaze flickered between the dog and Elijah's still body, uncertainty darkening his features. The other soldiers nodded silently. They had seen Orion in combat, fierce, disciplined, unwavering. But now he looked lost, defeated. It was a sight none of them were prepared for. The chaplain shifted uncomfortably. "Dogs don't grieve like we do," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "But they do understand loss." His fingers tightened around the Bible in his lap. "Sometimes they hold on longer than we think possible." His voice trailed off, his expression unreadable. Then Orion moved, Slowly, almost reluctantly, he lifted his head and looked at Elijah's face. He let out a soft whimper, nudging the soldier's chin with his nose. Pause, a moment of stillness. And then, in a single motion, he straightened himself and sat upright, his ears high, his posture alert. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. It was as if, in that moment, Orion was waiting for something. A command, an order, permission to leave his post. Margaret felt her breath catch. She turned toward the chaplain, her voice barely a whisper. "Is he?" She couldn't finish the sentence, but the chaplain understood. He exhaled slowly, his gaze softening as he looked at Orion. And then, in a voice steady and low, he said the words that no one else could. "At ease, soldier." Orion's ears twitched. His gaze remained locked on Elijah's still face for a long, agonizing moment. And then, his muscles relaxed, his tail uncurled slightly, his breathing slowed. It was as if, finally, he had received the order he needed to let go. Margaret wiped at her eyes, barely holding back a sob. The soldiers in the room remained silent, watching as Orion, ever so gently, laid his head down one last time. This time, he wasn't waiting for Elijah to wake up. He was saying goodbye. The weight in the chapel was unbearable. Every person in the room felt it. Something deeper than grief, heavier than sorrow. It was the moment before goodbye, the kind of silence that stretched long and endless, as if time itself had slowed in reverence. Orion, once rigid with resistance, now lay still, his head resting against Elijah's chest. His body had relaxed, but his eyes remained open, watching. Margaret sat beside the casket, her hands still buried in Orion's fur. Her tears had stopped, but only because she had none left to shed. She had spent her whole life believing that death was the end, that when someone was gone, they were just gone. But as she watched Orion's quiet, unwavering devotion, she wondered if maybe she had been wrong. Maybe love, true, unbreakable love, didn't just vanish. Maybe it lingered, refusing to be erased. Sergeant Carter, standing a few feet away, exhaled sharply. He had seen men break in battle, had seen soldiers collapse under the weight of loss. But nothing had prepared him for this. His throat was tight as he stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Orion's back. The dog didn't flinch. He just breathed, slow and deep, as if savoring every last second beside his fallen partner. The chaplain, his voice steady despite the emotions in his eyes, spoke softly. "Orion's job was to protect Elijah," he murmured, "and now he's making sure he gets home safely." Margaret bit her lip, nodding, but her heart clenched at the truth in those words. Orion had been at Elijah's side through war, through danger, through every impossible moment, and now he refused to leave him, even in death. The officer who had brought Orion hesitated, then took a deep breath. Slowly, gently, he reached for the dog's collar. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "It's time." For a moment, it seemed Orion wouldn't move. He stayed there, pressed against Elijah, his body frozen as if he could somehow hold on just a little longer. Then, as if sensing the inevitable, he let out a slow, deep sigh. His ears twitched, his tail gave a weak flick, and finally, he shifted. Margaret felt her breath hitch as Orion lifted his head. His eyes lingered on Elijah's face, searching, remembering. Then, with one last nudge against his soldier's chest, he stepped back. The movement was slow, reluctant, but deliberate. He wasn't being pulled away, he was choosing to let go. The chapel was silent as Orion stepped down from the casket. Soldiers straightened their backs. Margaret pressed a shaking hand to her lips. Even the chaplain lowered his head, whispering a quiet prayer. Orion sat at the foot of the casket, his posture still proud, still strong. But there was something different now. He wasn't waiting anymore. He wasn't searching. He was simply there, honoring the man who had been his partner, his protector, his everything. And just like that, the moment everyone had been dreading had arrived. The funeral had to begin. Orion showed that true love never dies. Do you believe the bond between humans and animals goes beyond life? Tell me in the comments. The chapel doors creaked as they were pushed open, allowing a gust of cold air to slip inside. The shift in temperature sent a shiver through the room. but no one moved. The moment had arrived. The funeral was about to begin, and soon Elijah Calloway would be laid to rest. Margaret straightened her back, wiping away the last of her tears. Her brother had been many things: a soldier, a protector, a friend. But above all, he had been hers. The ache in her chest was unbearable. But as she looked at Orion, now sitting quietly at the foot of the casket, she found the strength to breathe. He wasn't just Elijah's partner, he was family. And now he was grieving too. The chaplain cleared his throat, stepping forward. His voice, steady yet laced with emotion, filled the chapel. Today we gather not only to honor Sergeant Elijah Calloway's service, but to remember the man he was: brave, loyal, and above all, selfless. He paused, glancing at the folded flag atop the casket. He gave his life for others, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The soldiers in attendance remained rigid, their discipline unwavering, but their faces told a different story. Their eyes shone with unshed tears, their jaws clenched tightly. They had fought beside Elijah. They had seen him risk everything without hesitation, and now they had to say goodbye. Then the sound of boots striking the polished floor echoed through the room. The honor guard stepped forward, their movements precise and controlled. With slow, deliberate care, they reached for the flag draped over Elijah's casket. The crisp folds, the silent precision. It was a ritual they had performed countless times, but today it felt different. He wasn't just another fallen soldier. He was theirs. As the flag was lifted, Orion let out a low whimper. It was barely audible, but it sent a tremor through the room. Margaret sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. He knew. He knew. One of the officers knelt in front of Margaret, holding the folded flag in his gloved hands. His voice was firm but gentle. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. Margaret reached out with trembling hands, clutching the flag tightly against her chest. It was heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. A final gift, a final goodbye. Then the first shot rang out. The 21-gun salute shattered the silence, each blast cutting through the air like a heartbeat. The soldiers outside fired in perfect unison, their movements synchronized, their faces unreadable. Margaret flinched with each shot, but Orion didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the casket, his ears high. He didn't flinch. He didn't whimper. He simply watched as if standing guard one last time. Then came the sound that broke everyone, a single haunting note. The bugler lifted his trumpet, pressing it against his lips, and began to play taps. The melody carried through the chapel, slow and mournful, each note sinking deep into the hearts of those who listened. Orion's head lowered, his ears drooped. His body, once tense, seemed to deflate as the song reached its final notes. The last sound faded into silence, and in that moment, Orion did something no one expected. He lay down beside the casket, pressing his body close to where Elijah rested, and let out a deep, heavy sigh, not of sadness, but of acceptance. The final echoes of taps faded into the cold air, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke, even the wind outside had quieted, as if the entire world had paused to mourn the loss of Sergeant Elijah Calloway. Orion remained lying beside the casket, his body pressed against it as if refusing to let go. His breathing was steady now, calmer than before, but his eyes held a distant sorrow. He had been trained to fight, to protect, to never leave his handler's side, and yet, for the first time, he had no orders to follow, no mission to complete, just an emptiness that stretched endlessly before him. Margaret sat with the folded flag clutched tightly against her chest. It still carried the warmth of the soldier who had handed it to her, but even that heat was beginning to fade. Her fingers trembled as she traced the perfectly pressed folds, her throat tightening with the weight of reality. Elijah was really gone. There was no waking up from this, no phone call, no letters from deployment, just this flag, this funeral, and the unbearable absence of her brother. Sergeant Carter stepped forward, his normally steady voice laced with grief. "We should take Orion outside," he murmured, glancing at the chaplain. "The service is almost over." Margaret turned her gaze to Orion. He hadn't moved since taps ended, his body still curled protectively beside the casket. Gently, she reached out and ran her fingers through his fur. "Orion," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The dog didn't react. Carter knelt beside him, his movements slow, careful. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. "It's time to go." Orion finally shifted, but it was not an act of obedience. It was reluctance. Slowly, painstakingly, he lifted his head, his ears flicking back as if listening for something no one else could hear. Then after one last nuzzle against the casket, he rose to his feet. A sigh of relief rippled through the chapel. But then Orion did something that made Margaret's heart stop. He turned away from Elijah's casket, took 3 slow steps forward, then suddenly turned back. His ears perked, his tail wagged just once, as if he had seen something, as if someone had called his name. Margaret's breath hitched, Carter's brow furrowed. The chaplain whispered a quiet prayer under his breath. Orion lingered for a second longer, his deep brown eyes locked on something unseen. Then just as quickly as the moment arrived, it passed. He lowered his head, his body finally accepting the weight of farewell, and walked toward the chapel doors. Margaret felt a cold shiver run down her spine, because for a split second, she could have sworn Orion had been looking at Elijah. The chapel doors groaned as they swung open, letting in a gust of cold air. Orion stepped forward slowly, his paws making no sound against the polished floor. The moment he crossed the threshold, a shiver ran down Margaret's spine. The weight of the ceremony, the loss, the finality of it all pressed down on her. But something else lingered in the air, something she couldn't explain. She clutched the folded flag tighter against her chest, watching as Orion hesitated just outside the chapel. He turned his head slightly, glancing over his shoulder, not at the people, not at the casket, but at the empty space near the altar. His ears twitched, his posture stiffened. It was brief, barely noticeable, but Margaret saw it and she knew. Sergeant Carter noticed it too. He inhaled sharply, glancing between Orion and the silent space he was staring at. "You saw that, right?" he muttered under his breath. Margaret just nodded, unable to speak. The chaplain, who had remained quiet since taps, finally broke the silence. "Sometimes," he murmured, his voice solemn, "love doesn't leave so easily." His words sent a chill through Margaret's bones. She had never been one to believe in spirits, in things beyond this world. But the way Orion had looked back, the way his tail had flicked just slightly, as if recognizing someone, it unsettled her. Outside, the funeral procession was waiting. Soldiers stood in perfect formation, their faces stoic, their hands clasped behind their backs. The hearse gleamed under the afternoon sun, ready to carry Elijah to his final resting place. It was time. The world was moving forward. But Orion? He stayed frozen at the doorway. His deep brown eyes remained fixed on the empty space inside the chapel, and Margaret swore she saw something flicker in them. Recognition, longing, or maybe even peace. Then with one last slow breath, Orion lowered his head and stepped into the sunlight. Margaret followed, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she had just witnessed. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just grief playing tricks on her mind. Or maybe Elijah had never really left. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery. The folded flag in Margaret's arms felt heavier with each step, as if the weight of Elijah's absence was settling into her bones. The honor guard stood in silent formation, their presence a solemn reminder of the duty and sacrifice that had brought them all here. Orion walked beside her, his movements slow but steady. His usual alertness was subdued, his ears slightly lowered, his tail hanging still. He had followed Elijah through war zones, through chaos, through danger, and now he was following him one last time. The casket was placed with precision above the open grave, and the chaplain stepped forward, his voice steady despite the sorrow that filled the air. Sergeant Elijah Calloway dedicated his life to service, to his country, to his fellow soldiers, and to the bond that can never be broken between a man and his K-9 partner. He glanced at Orion, his eyes softening. Even now, that bond remains. Margaret felt her throat tighten. The soldiers around her remained motionless, but their grief was palpable. Carter stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the casket. No matter how many times they had stood at funerals like this, it never got easier. Then Orion did something that made Margaret's breath hitch. He moved forward, stepping right up to the casket. His nose twitched as he sniffed the polished wood, his eyes filled with something deeper than sadness, understanding. He let out a slow exhale, then straightened his posture, standing tall, proud, and then, with deliberate precision, he lifted his paw and placed it gently on the casket. The cemetery fell into complete silence. Soldiers who had held their composure wiped their eyes. Margaret pressed her lips together to keep from breaking. Carter turned his head slightly, taking in a shaky breath. Even the chaplain hesitated, as if giving the moment the respect it deserved. Orion stayed there for a long moment, unmoving. It was not a plea, not a cry. It was a final act of loyalty, one last mission, one last promise. Then, just as quietly as he had stepped forward, Orion lowered his paw and stepped back. He sat at Margaret's feet, his head held high, his body still. He had done his duty. He had said his farewell. Margaret reached down, running her fingers through his fur. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Good boy." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the grass, carrying with it the echoes of a life well lived. And in that moment, Margaret swore she felt something. Something warm, something familiar. A presence, just for a second, standing beside them. But when she looked up, there was nothing. Nothing but the sound of the flag being handed to a grieving sister. Nothing but the strength of a dog who had just lost his best friend. Nothing but the certainty that some bonds never truly break. The funeral was over. The soldiers had given their final salute. The flag had been folded, handed over with careful precision. The sound of boots retreating across the cemetery echoed in the fading light, leaving behind only Margaret, Orion, and the weight of an ending they weren't ready to accept. Margaret stood still, staring at the fresh mound of earth where her brother now rested. The world felt quieter, emptier. She had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the finality of it. Beside her, Orion sat motionless, his gaze locked on the gravestone as if waiting for one last command. She knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "He's not coming back, boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know you don't understand." But she stopped, her throat tightening. Did she even understand? Did anyone? Orion let out a slow breath, his body finally starting to relax. The grief was still there, heavy and deep, but something in him had shifted. He was no longer searching, no longer waiting, just remembering. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. She thought about Elijah, his laugh, his stubbornness, the way he had always made her feel safe, no matter how far away he was. She thought about the way Orion had looked back inside the chapel, the way he had stood at the casket, the way he had placed his paw so gently, so deliberately, as if saying, "I was here, I was yours." A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't just from sadness. It was from something else, something lighter. Maybe love didn't end, even in death. Maybe some soul stayed close, watching, protecting, waiting. Orion suddenly lifted his head, his ears twitching. For a brief second, he stared at the empty,